Canadians are expressing their anger with the Trump administration's
It is the kind of economic warning that jolts an entire country awake. Canadian supermarkets are abandoning United States produce at a pace not seen in modern North American trade history, and the shockwaves are only beginning to surface. What started as a small grocery store experiment has rapidly turned into a nationwide movement fueled by political frustration, escalating tariffs, and a growing belief that Canada must reassert its independence in the face of disrespect from Washington. For more than 117 days, a single store in British Columbia refused to sell any fruits or vegetables grown in the United States. That quiet defiance soon became a catalyst. Across the country, shoppers began redirecting their spending, retailers rewired supply chains, and imports from Mexico, Peru, New Zealand, South Africa, and Egypt surged to fill the space that the United States once dominated, without question. Behind the rising tension is a deeper wound. The claim that Canada is the 51st state of America, a remark that many Canadians saw as the clearest proof of unequal partnership. Combined with years of tariff disputes and aggressive trade posturing, the emotional backlash has now transformed into a structural shift in the market. And here is the real question. If this movement continues, what major economic revelation will Washington face by the end of this story? Stay through the final part, because the answer may redefine the future of North American trade. A far more concerning pattern is now emerging across Canada's retail and import landscape. The country's food supply chain is beginning to detach from the United States in ways that economists once believed were impossible under the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. For decades, the United States supplied the overwhelming majority of Canada's fresh produce, holding a position so dominant that few imagined it could ever be replaced. Yet the latest import records show that the structural pillars of that dependency are eroding at a speed that has stunned trade analysts. Wholesale distributors in Ontario, Alberta, and Quebec are reporting sharp pivots in sourcing contracts, with many negotiating long-term agreements with suppliers in Latin America, Oceania, and even parts of Africa. Several Canadian logistics firms, which previously relied on daily shipments from California and Washington State, are re-engineering their operations around shipping lanes that bypass the United States entirely. This means new ports, new inspection protocols, new storage systems, and new pricing models, all designed to function without relying on American producers. The broader consequence is even more alarming for Washington. When a country restructures its food import network, it does not simply switch suppliers. It rewrites commercial habits, trade behavior, and national resilience. Once these new systems stabilize, reversing them becomes extraordinarily expensive and politically risky. Early economic modeling suggests that the United States could face significant multi-billion-dollar revenue losses within the next 6 to 12 months if the trend accelerates. Equally troubling is the psychological shift occurring among Canadian consumers. Market research shows a rising willingness to endure higher prices, seasonal shortages, and unfamiliar brands, a behavior that signals the emergence of a values-driven marketplace. In other words, Canadians are making economic decisions based on identity and principle, rather than convenience or cost. When this mindset takes hold nationally, it reshapes entire industries. For the United States, the implications extend far beyond produce aisles. A weakening presence in Canada's retail ecosystem could jeopardize trade leverage, reduce diplomatic influence, and accelerate competitive gains for rival exporters eager to capture a wealthy and stable market. But here is the looming question that policymakers in Washington fear the most. What happens if Canadian retailers decide that this shift should not be temporary but permanent? The answer, revealed later, could mark the most dramatic realignment in North American trade since the 1990s. A deeper examination reveals that Canada's transformation is not limited to consumer behavior or political symbolism. The nation's agricultural and retail sectors are undergoing one of the most abrupt realignments in their history. For decades, the United States served as the linchpin of Canada's fresh produce supply, accounting for more than half of all fruits and vegetables entering the country. Yet the sudden migration toward alternative suppliers is forcing Canada to reinvent the logistical architecture behind its food system. Canadian wholesalers now distribute their sourcing across multiple continents, often maintaining active contracts with suppliers in Mexico, Peru, Chile, New Zealand, South Africa, and Egypt simultaneously. This diversification reduces dependency but introduces higher operational complexity. Every shipment requires new sanitary certifications, transport insurance models, seasonal forecasting, and port coordination. For retailers, especially national chains, these adjustments demand additional warehousing, reevaluated pricing strategies, and the acceptance of higher volatility in product availability. For consumers, the shift is a double-edged sword. They enjoy an expanded variety of international goods, but they must also confront the reality of fluctuating prices. Many households report paying more for staples such as grapes, berries, and citrus, yet the willingness to persist reflects a growing prioritization of sovereignty-driven purchasing choices. Sociologists studying the trend refer to this as economic identity formation, a stage where national sentiment becomes intertwined with daily consumption. This sentiment is reinforced by repeated supply chain narratives circulating in Canadian media, the need for resilience, independence, and protection from external political shocks. As a result, the public has become more accepting of global sourcing even when it introduces short-term inconvenience. For Canada, this marks the beginning of a long-term behavioral shift that no longer treats American imports as the unquestioned default. However, the more striking revelation lies beyond Canada's borders. The ripple effects of this consumer awakening are beginning to alter international trade flows on a scale that neither Ottawa nor Washington fully anticipated. And what those numbers reveal next could force both nations to confront an uncomfortable reality that is still unfolding. For the United States, the implications of Canada's pivot are significantly more severe. Losing access to a major export market like Canada, the United States' largest agricultural customer, destabilizes revenue projections across multiple states. California, Washington State, Oregon, Arizona, and Florida depend heavily on Canadian demand to absorb their seasonal produce surpluses. Even a modest decline in shipments can translate into substantial financial strain for growers, distributors, trucking companies, and rural economies. American producers are already beginning to feel the early tremors. Trade associations report declining order volumes, longer inventory hold times, and rising storage costs as exports to Canada soften. Analysts warn that if the trend continues, some sectors could face multi-billion-dollar losses within a single fiscal cycle. For example, the grape and berry sectors, which rely heavily on cross-border movement, face the prospect of oversupply if Canada continues shifting toward Latin American alternatives. Beyond direct financial impact, the strategic cost may prove even more damaging. Canada has long functioned as the United States' most stable, predictable, and lucrative export partner. Losing shelf space in that market, especially to emerging competitors, diminishes American influence, not only in retail commerce, but also in broader trade negotiations. Once supermarkets reconfigure procurement pipelines, and once consumers adapt to replacement brands, the United States faces a well-documented challenge in global trade. Clawing back lost market share is significantly harder than preserving it. Compounding the problem is the growing international appetite to fill any void left by American absence. Global exporters see Canada as a high-income, low-risk market that offers long-term security. As they gain ground, their economies strengthen, their logistics operations expand, and their bargaining positions improve. Meanwhile, the United States risks losing its status as a dominant agricultural supplier in North America, a position it has held for generations. Yet the most unsettling question remains unanswered. What hidden vulnerability inside the United States agricultural economy becomes exposed if Canada's shift intensifies over the next 12 months? The revelation coming later in this analysis could be the most consequential warning Washington has faced in 2 decades of North American trade. In Washington, the political reaction to Canada's shifting import behavior is growing more anxious with each passing quarter. Senior officials at the United States Department of Agriculture and the United States Trade Representative Office now face mounting pressure from farming states that depend heavily on the Canadian market. Legislators representing California, Washington State, Arizona, Michigan, and Florida are privately warning that declining exports could trigger job losses, farm closures, and insolvency among mid-sized agricultural businesses. The strategic concern extends far beyond temporary financial setbacks. Canada has long served as the United States anchor market, a dependable buyer that stabilizes prices for American growers even during volatile global conditions. When that anchor loosens, the United States enters unfamiliar terrain. Without Canada's consistent demand, surplus crops must be redirected to markets that often offer lower profit margins, stricter regulations, or greater political uncertainty. Inside trade policy circles, analysts are raising red flags. If Canada continues to realign its sourcing toward Latin America, Oceania, and Africa, American negotiating leverage during future trade disputes could erode sharply. A reduced economic footprint weakens Washington's ability to use market access as a diplomatic tool. This is particularly significant during periods of rising global competition, where agricultural exports remain one of the few areas where the United States traditionally maintains overwhelming advantage. There is also a growing fear that Canada's consumer-driven shift could inspire similar movements elsewhere. European Union consumers have become increasingly sensitive to political rhetoric and human rights concerns when choosing imported goods. Several Asian markets, notably Japan and South Korea, are watching Canadian sentiment closely as they weigh their own trade diversification strategies. If these nations perceive a long-term decline in American reliability or respect toward allies, they may quietly reduce their dependence on United States agricultural imports. For policymakers in Washington, the scenario is deeply troubling. A combination of economic loss, diplomatic erosion, and reputational decline converging at the same moment. But even this is not the most alarming part, because as internal reports circulate through congressional committees, a far more consequential warning is emerging, a warning that could reshape how the United States views Canada's role in its broader geopolitical strategy. Outside North America, the world is responding to Canada's market shift with unprecedented speed. Major agricultural exporters are treating the situation as a once-in-a-generation opening to displace the United States in a high-income market. Mexico has already expanded its berry and avocado production capacity specifically for Canadian buyers. Peru, which recently surpassed the United States in grape exports to Canada, is negotiating multi-year volume guarantees with several Canadian wholesalers. New Zealand and Chile are investing aggressively in controlled atmosphere shipping technology to ensure their fruits arrive in top condition despite long transit routes. For these nations, Canada's restructuring is more than an opportunity, it is an inflection point. If they can establish durable supply chains now, they gain long-term influence over Canadian pricing, availability, and seasonal balance. Their private sector logistics networks are expanding rapidly to seize this moment, and governments are offering diplomatic support through trade delegations and export financing programs. Meanwhile, multinational retailers operating in Canada, including those headquartered in Europe and Asia, view the decline of American dominance as a chance to standardize sourcing strategies across multiple regions. If a retailer can centralize procurement in Chile or South Africa rather than juggling separate United States and international pipelines, operational complexity decreases and bargaining power increases. This global enthusiasm stands in stark contrast to Washington's unease. While the United States grapples with shrinking influence, rival exporters are strengthening their positions and forging new alliances. It is a race in which Canada has inadvertently become the deciding battlefield. However, trade economists are increasingly pointing to a deeper, more systemic consequence, one that neither Canada nor the global exporters have fully considered. If the current trend continues, what long-term structural shift will the world see inside the United States agricultural economy, a shift that could permanently alter the balance of power in North American trade? The answer, revealed soon, may be the most unsettling twist in this entire story. As Canada moves deeper into its new trade posture, policymakers in Ottawa are beginning to outline long-term strategies that prioritize resilience, diversification, and political autonomy. The shift is not merely a response to short-term tensions, it is quickly becoming a structural doctrine guiding future import decisions. Government agencies are studying models from the European Union and Australia, where diversified food networks are used as safeguards against geopolitical shocks, climate disruptions, and international disputes. Canada is now encouraging retailers and distributors to develop multi-origin supply chains for essential commodities, reducing exposure to singular points of failure. Investment in cold chain infrastructure is increasing across major ports, with Vancouver, Montreal, and Halifax receiving budget allocations for expanded temperature-controlled storage. This creates a logistics ecosystem supportive of year-round sourcing from more distant regions, ensuring product availability even when North American supply becomes unstable. Domestically, agricultural innovation has become a central policy theme. Provinces are pushing for greenhouse expansion, vertical farming pilots, and climate-resilient crop research to reduce reliance on unpredictable international markets. The long-term intention is clear. Canada wants to guarantee its own food security while maintaining the flexibility to choose trade partners based on principle, not necessity. Economists warn that this new doctrine represents a silent but profound recalibration of Canada's position in North American commerce. Once a nation heavily intertwined with the United States supply chain, Canada is redefining itself as a country capable of shaping its own economic destiny. But this transformation introduces a new layer of geopolitical complexity that could pressure the United States in ways it is not prepared to confront. For the United States, the long-term landscape is far more precarious. The agricultural sector has historically functioned as both an economic engine and a diplomatic asset. Maintaining dominance in North American food exports allowed the United States to exercise soft power, secure favorable negotiations, and stabilize critical industries in key farming states. If Canada's strategic realignment deepens, the United States risks losing the foundation of that influence. Reduced dependency from one of its closest allies diminishes the leverage Washington can use in broader trade disputes. This could weaken the United States' position not only in North America, but also in multilateral forums where credibility depends on the ability to command and maintain market leadership. Competing nations are aware of this vulnerability and have begun positioning themselves accordingly. Several governments are preparing incentive packages to attract Canadian import contracts, while private exporters offer long-term pricing guarantees that American producers may struggle to match. As these alternatives mature, the United States could find itself pushed out of a market that once required minimal effort to maintain. The deeper strategic risk lies in perception. If other nations observe the United States losing influence in a market as close and historically aligned as Canada, they may interpret it as a sign of diminishing American reliability. This perception alone could accelerate a broader shift in global trade alliances, leaving Washington with fewer dependable partners and reduced negotiating strength. Yet trade strategists are now debating a far more ominous question, one that cuts to the core of the United States economic model. What critical structural weakness inside American agriculture becomes exposed if Canada's long-term shift becomes permanent? The revelation, coming in the conclusion, may redefine how Washington must approach every future trade war and every tariff decision from this moment forward. The emerging reality is stark. Canada's accelerating shift away from United States agricultural imports is no longer a temporary reaction nor a symbolic protest. It is becoming a structural transformation of one of the most tightly interconnected trade relationships in the world. What Canada builds now, new suppliers, new logistics corridors, new consumer habits, will define its economic path for years, perhaps decades to come. For the United States, the warning is unmistakable. A long-standing pillar of American economic influence is being tested in a way few in Washington anticipated. The growing willingness of Canada, a close ally, to rewrite its trade dependencies raises difficult questions about how the United States will maintain leadership during an era of escalating global competition and widespread trade recalibration. As both countries move deeper into this uncertain future, one critical dilemma remains unresolved. Is this the moment when North America's economic balance begins to tilt permanently? Or will Washington take decisive steps to restore confidence before the shift becomes irreversible? The answer will shape every future tariff decision, every agricultural strategy, and every trade war to come.